especially that work here, they were so excited when they heard that Johan was going to come back to FC Barcelona. Uh, but I suppose that you are no relationship to Johan Cruyff, the legend.
Good diplomat is immune to flatteries.
Um, well, I have to start by asking you this, and of course, thank you for joining us here. We're so happy. I always want to start by this. All the students here in the room, they come from all over the world. They choose Barcelona to live and study here. You've lived also all over the world. I think maybe 4 or 5 continents over the course of perhaps 50 years. How would you like to be posted in Barcelona?
I would love to do it. I would have the same choice. If the European Union Business School was known to me when I was a student, I definitely would have come to here. Because what you have here, well, apart from the diversity of this school and the complementarities, and you learn from each other, there is also that kind of, you had the mountains on one side, the sea on the other side, and just in the middle, an intellectual bruising life that you are participating at every day. I'm jealous, ex post factum, but then again, we continue. There are still other things to do, but Barcelona is fantastic.
Yes, and we want to learn from you today a little bit about diplomatic skills. The students here, they have learned, of course, all of you have learned over the past few years about business skills. Now we see a little bit of a merging of diplomatic skills and business skills in today's world of geopolitics. I have the impression
And
we've got more and more business leaders in powerful countries, not to name anyone specifically, who bring their business skills to the world of diplomacy. Uh, does that work?
well, basically, I think the skills are more or less the same in terms of what I wrote in my little book, negotiation, speaking in public, interacting with the press with an assertive and sometimes aggressive press. But today it's a conversational issue. But no, the skills are basically the same, but the way you play them out is different. And the difference basically is that a diplomat thinks in long term and thinks empathically. A businessman is more preoccupied, rightly so, on the short term, making sure that he get whatever he wishes to get. A businessman is also more transactional. He takes his little calculator and says, "What's in it for me?" A diplomat will look a little bit more. What we call is more value based. A businessman is interest based. I have my concrete interests well defined and that kind of stuff. Whereas a diplomat also goes for values, democracy, human rights, and that kind of things. And that we have to inculcate in what we do and what we can ask from the other party. And again, the empathetical dimension is an important one because we deal with people with whom we will have to deal in the long term. A business deal can be one shot and then you get it.
All right. No, I think that's very informative, and any similar anything we see similar to the real world, it may or may not be coincidental, I suppose, in your remarks. Um, but let me ask you this, because I want to make sure we really focus on these diplomatic skills, because diplomatic skills, of course, can be useful in business. It can be useful for people as they build out their career to use some diplomatic skills. So I want to focus most of our conversation on that. Um, Let me ask you one more question on geopolitics today. I think we live in a world where we see a lot more assertive, real power. Um, and that's a little bit unusual from what I think most of us were used to as we were growing up. We thought we lived a little bit more in a world of, yeah, soft power and diplomacy. Could you tell us what is actually the difference between power and authority, and why does it matter?
Yeah. Well, the, first, before coming to power and authority, the world today indeed is somewhat more complicated than it was until 20, 30 years ago. For the simple reason that until that time, we basically lived in what we call a rules based world order. After the Second World War in Europe, we had the United Nations, we had the Helsinki agreements, we had the European Union. Basically, what we said is working together, multilateral diplomacy, that's what we call the organization, international organizations. That's the recipe for the future. And we don't want to regress to the kind of conflicts we had in the past. Something changed as of, I would say, 2000, 2005. And that is that new powers were emerging, China, other powers who had been perhaps slightly humiliated, Russia, took up a ring in a slightly revanchist mood of thought. We had you have China, you have Russia, you have the United States, a strong player, and still today, I think, the great power number one, but in relative terms, losing a little bit of that power. And then you have the European Union, who in fact is the best disciple of the class, the best students in the class, but who is not recognized for those, those features that it has, because these features are soft features, whereas the others are playing it hard. And now we come to the distinction between power and authority. Power is directly linked to the assets that you have. Material assets. You remember the question that Stalin was asking to the Pope, how many divisions? That's the kind of questions the great powers ask each other. And that's hard power. They play it hard. Power is shifting, power is emerging. One power looks at the other very reluctantly. And there is a game, and this is a core sentence. There is a game of testing and teasing. And look at what happens. For instance, in Russia, in Georgia, testing and teasing and asking the question, how far can I go without going too far? That's basically the game that we watch now. Russia, China in the Southeast China Sea with Taiwan, again, picks pricks to see just what kind of reaction does that bring to the neighbors in Asia and elsewhere. And that is power politics. Authority, that is something that we, for instance, Europeans, we still have that. But then again, what is authority worth if the others play it hard? And that is why Europe is now rethinking its portfolio, if I may say so, its portfolio of assets, and adding some hard assets to the soft assets for which it had been recognized anyway. And you see that, for instance, as far as the defense is concerned, and recreating a defense industry, that a lot of efforts are currently made in order for us also to have that hard dimension so that we can become from a global player, which we definitely are, we can become a great power. That's the distinction I think between global player and great power.
If I can ask you a follow-up question to that, when I hear that, I find it extremely fascinating, and I wonder, do all diplomats think in these terms? If we see geopolitical events today or at any time in history, would you say that by and large, that is, they are done with the understanding that they are part of a power game, that they are testing, that is something that they
Well,
do consciously, or is it,
yeah, no,
impulsive sometimes?
no, well, that's a very good question. And I think we must dare say, and it's not a pleasant thought that I'm going to share with you, but we must dare say that at the end of the day, ultimately, it's power that counts. I would go one step further. Today, we are even witnessing brute power playing its role. And that is something that we in Europe have underestimated the place of power in international politics. And particularly now that it is a game of brute power, we got a wake up call.
Mm.
A little too late, if you ask me, because in the meantime, the other powers are still going on and increasing their power base, if I may say so. But I hope that we will find an equilibrium because at the end of the day, international politics is a question of balance. We must find a new balance. You have a lot of people, and I stop there, who say we live in a multipolar world. I don't agree. We live in a world that is in search of a new balance, a new equilibrium that most probably will be multipolar. But right now, the very question, the $1 million question is, will it be China or the US? That is the question which is right out.
Mm.
And I think artificial intelligence is going to be a very critical point in that search for who will be the predominant power in the world.
Yeah, and that brings us already a little bit closer again to the reality of most of us today. We are looking also as this great power game. Go ahead, please. As this great power game is happening, with very often real and very painful consequences for regular people. We as individuals are also looking for our way in life. People have come to study here. They've chosen Barcelona, I hope, because of the excellent education they get here, also because they think it's a nice place to be. As we look for our way further on in life and we see this great power game happening, what kind of choices should we make individually? Should we now play it safe and go to a powerful country and try to live and work there? Or should we try to go about our life in the way that we see best fit? What is the consequence for us today?
Well, if I were you, I think I would make more or less the following calculation. That is that I definitely wouldn't go for a power country just for the sake of power. That would be, I think, a short kind of too short a calculation or judgment. I would try to go in places where there is the right balance between power and power projection. As we say in diplomacy, power projection is what your power means, because we Europeans, we have a lot of power. We are the economic power number one. That's a fact. The problem is that we have not been able to convert that economic power in political, l- military power, if I may say so. I would go for countries that have the right mix, that while having a good doses of power, still, and now comes the point, still continue to believe in fundamental values in the first place. And the fundamental values, that's we call that with a big kind of sacrosanct labels: democracy, human rights, you know, yeah, that kind of things. It's not because the elegance of those concepts that I say that. It's because at the end of the day, ultimately, you will be judged on who you are, what the values are for which you strive. And countries like Canada, Australia, I personally would find quite interesting,
Mm.
because I find they have a kind of balance between, yes, we know what power is, and we are ready to play in that power game, while at the same time caring for those basic values. You should know that in this world right now, everybody has trembles from those powerful, great powers that I just mentioned. But in the polls, the international global polls that have been made, the question has been asked: in what continent do you have most trust, confidence? And there Europe stands at 76%.
Mm.
We go for 76% for the European Union. And it's much less when you ask, and what about China? What about Russia? And what about the US?
Mm.
So that says something of how I would make that kind of calculation.
Yeah. In addition, of course, to all the business considerations we might make
That,
and where the business opportunities are.
of course.
Um, Let me ask you about some specific diplomatic skills that you've gained in your career, because you really have lived the world over. You've been in Central Africa, you've been in Lebanon when there was a war there. You've been really in Chile when there was the authoritarian regime of Pinochet. You've really been everywhere. Um, and in very difficult situations both personally, right? Because it's dangerous and difficult, I suppose, also in terms of what role can you play there while staying true to your values. So tell us a little bit about what you've learned from those experiences. How can you be useful in a dangerous situation, dangerous both to yourself and to your values?
Well, let me start out with a basic premise in diplomacy. That is that the more serious the problem out there is, the more you enjoy being a diplomat.
Mm.
It's paradoxical, but we are the kind of doctors, of the international community. And when there is a serious problem, then we kind of say, that's interesting, let's work on it. That's one of the reasons why, in the structure of my career, I started out with what he called field diplomacy. I wanted to see how the real world was out there. I live in Belgium. I was born in Belgium. I studied in part in Belgium, in part in France, and in the United States at Yale University. But basically, I could have chosen Paris as a first posting. And from Paris, I could go to Barcelona. Why not? Consul General and that kind of things. That was definitely not the way I saw diplomacy. I saw diplomacy as a challenge. I wanted to see what is a war country. Perhaps among you, there are people coming from countries where currently a war is going on. I lived in Lebanon in the early 80s. Perhaps some people from the Middle East are here. Early 80s, in the middle of the Civil War. And there were bombardments all day, all day. I was there with wife and two children. My wife was incidental. She was even pregnant at the time. But we lived through that and we never complained. We just say, at least we try to understand the mind of a people living in conflict. And what function can we do there? Well, we can indeed, as an intermediary, because basically diplomacy is always about talking, breaking it down, speaking with people, speaking with the opposing party, and being a middleman. That is what we call mediation. We mediate in conflict. That you can, in such countries, do something which is really tangible and useful in diplomatic terms and bringing those communities back again to work. And the same was true, well, in Burundi, well, in the center of Africa, the issues were different. The issue there was that it was a very authoritarian regime, while the population was poor. In addition to that, even their basic human rights were not properly addressed. So again, you try to work as good as you can to give those people hope and confidence in the future.
Um, And is it possible for you not to get tainted? Specifically when you work in under an authoritarian regime. This is a challenge that we've seen in business. You know, we've had global business guests here, for example, the chairman of Nestle, having to make decisions about, do we stay in a country at war? Do we stay in an aggressor country? Do we stay in a country where it's dangerous? For you as a diplomat, how do you avoid getting tainted from interacting with regimes that may be seen as evil regimes, as bad regimes?
Well, for us, of course, as diplomats, the perspective is slightly different. As I said, in a certain sense, the more problematic the country is, riskier in business terms, the more they need us. Whereas if I were a businessman, then of course you make risk assessment and you have those risk assessments for all countries. Then you see what is the risk for my business. But your business is somewhat different from what we care for in terms of making sure that these countries can come back to a peaceful situation.
There is no point at which you say it is now harmful to do diplomacy.
No, you can't say that. And that is why we have diplomats working sometimes in the most difficult countries you can imagine, and perhaps being the last. It's like on a ship, like it's the captain who is the last to leave the ship. Very often, diplomats are the last to leave a ship. For instance, I've been in East Timor as well. There was a small UN community there working for the people. Then there was the war, and some of the colleagues of the UN have been killed. You stay until the end. We've seen that with Gaza now as well. The UN has been continued to working as good as they could because that was a responsibility towards the people. And you easily understand that business in Gaza was not something that we were looking for during those 2 years.
You mentioned now the current conflicts. You know, there's of course Gaza that's on everyone's mind, and obviously for many years now we've had a conflict and an aggression of Russia and Ukraine. Um, as a diplomat, you also have to find a way to um, to be able to do your work, to allow for diplomacy, while at the same time understanding public opinion and how to work with that. I know you've been the chef de cabinet, the chief of staff in ministries, people who actually have to take political stances. And one of your lessons was you should never say no comment. You should always dare to engage. Tell us a little bit more about that, because I found it, especially in these current conflicts, and maybe it's because we don't really know about previous eras like the Cold War where there were big issues. I find it personally very difficult to be able to say, I would not be able to say no comment, and I could not say something and not upset anyone involved. Why do you then stick with this idea? No.
Well, the no comment, and again, that's I worry that out in the booklet, and I'm quite severe on that point. I tell a little story. I was a spokesperson of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for a couple of years. And then what you have your weekly press conference for the international press. And in Brussels, as you know, there's a lot of international press because we have NATO, European Union, and that kind of stuff. And then again, we had the Belgian press, of course. And then that was on Wednesday morning. On Tuesday afternoon, I toured around the ministry, all tricky questions, again, very often Middle East, East European, and so on. I went to one director to another. There was a standing rule. The spokesperson can come in the office and you stop everything and you just address this question, because I didn't have much time to prepare. So I did my tour, and then I ended up with the chef de cabinet of the minister to just check the answers I was going to answer to potential questions. You prepare the questions that you probably will get. And then I very often got as an answer, Johan, just try to turn a little bit around the hot potato. Don't speak about that hot potato, or else then you say no comment. And then I said, sorry, I'm the spokesperson. I'm not going to make myself ridicule, although I'm being paid to be a spokesman. And if you say be a ridicule person, then you are. But it's ridiculous for you and as a ministry to have as an answer just no comment. And I told him, and I got at the end of the day, I got it right. I told him, look, what does it mean to say no comment? Well, it means first, it's stupid. You're a spokesperson and you say, I'm not going to speak. What's the point of having a spokesperson if he ends up saying no comment? But also, and particularly, I told him, if you say no comment, then clearly your journalist over there knows that you know the answer and that you're hiding the answer. And there must be a reason why you wish to hide the answer. And I, journalist, I will find out what that reason is. So he goes shopping around and he end up next day when you open your newspaper with a story that is 10 times more worse than what you were and could have said openly. So my advice there is don't be afraid about saying just the truth. You know, I have a kind of philosophical stance, and that's for another conference, but about the banality of what happens. And the reason is simple. If something happens, the mere fact that it happened makes it a banality. A fact is a fact is a fact. So, in a certain sense, we should not be afraid about just telling the truth. Things happen. You know what the key thing is to which I refer, and the Americans are much more comfortable in that. They say, I made a mistake. Even we in European countries, we see that there is an evolution now of politicians speaking to the people, to the audiences, to the citizens in a much more direct and open style than they did 20, 30 years ago when they were kind of confiscated, vague terms.
And that's a good thing.
And that's the way to do it. You business people, you do it every day.
Well,
Do
thank you
but
for considering me a business person. I appreciate that.
no, but no,
Uh,
I mean,
I will try to live up to that status. Um, Now, of course, as business leaders today, business leaders are also often asked questions about any and all topic, including, of course, political and geopolitical topics, and including when in fact they don't have a seat at the table. Does that make it any different? When you talk about that you should never say no comment, of course, you're talking about cases where a ministry or a country has a seat at the table, has a stake, is a player, and is asked about what is going on.
mhm.
If you are not at the table if you are not able to affect a situation, an outcome, as a business leader, you're often still asked about what's going on in society, in politics, and so on. And the conundrum is, do I then still give my opinion or not? What would you say?
Well, I think that the business community is an important player in the diplomatic field as well. It's a non-diplomatic field player, but they are part of the big game of diplomacy in which economic interests take an important seat. And particularly big companies have a voice that is being registered. They may not be sitting at the table, but their interests may be of such an importance for us diplomats that we incorporate them in our narrative, in our story, and when we speak at the negotiating table, their interests will be reflected. So, in that sense, I think their influence may be sometimes larger than you may think,
Mm.
and perhaps sometimes be difficult to reconcile with political interests. And that's why I'm definitely not for what some call, an ethical foreign policy. It's very difficult to be always ethical in your foreign policy because in a foreign policy, you have contradictory interests at play. You have interests coming from the economic, you know, part of your society, and then you have the value side of your society, and you have to mix that together in what is a political position. And that is why politics is a difficult art because there is no science of politics. You always
So there is also not the supremacy of values either. You have to, as a politician, as a diplomat, you have to accept that there are different interests and that.
if I'm the Minister of Foreign Affairs, I come in Beijing. I have a lot of commercial interest and perhaps 10 contracts to be signed next day. Then I won't openly, at least, address the human rights issues in an open platform before the public at large. So I will do that in a discreet way, a kind of parallel way, but I'll do it because I have an accountability. I return home, and then the Belgian press or whoever will say, and did you raise the issue of the human rights? So that is the kind of complexity in which a politician finds himself, and then he will say yes. And then now comes the truth question, not the no comment question. Then he will say yes. But he will say, look, I have done that discreetly. I didn't want to shortcut the economic interests that I had to defend as well.
Mm.
And you people, you are mature enough, and now that's you are mature enough to understand that these two elements had to reconcile one way or another. And my reconciliation procedure consisted in we have the 10 contracts, and I raised the points in a discreet, tactful way.
Mm.
That's the kind of way we diplomats play that out.
I appreciate your candor and insights in dealing with these questions. Um, Maybe bringing it back one more time to your personal experience. I know that at some point in your career, you were also the UN emissary to Georgia at a time that Georgia was under attack or even, I think, invaded by Russia. That's, of course, an extremely delicate situation, and it brings, I think, brings up some similarities to the present day. Uh, how were you able to play a useful role in that situation?
Well, I kind of like that question because this brings us to sober diplomacy. One of the things that I definitely want to convey, since I have the occasion now, is don't super inflate diplomacy. I have written another book in which I do a deflationary exercise, bringing back diplomacy to reality. Reality, the prosaic reality of every day. And the reality of every day in the life of a diplomat is that you do it soberly, you go for the suboptimal, you are pleased with a partial solution, a provisional solution. All these terms, provisional, partial, plausible, suboptimal, you feel that we are not the perfectionist. I personally I am scared by perfectionists because they are the ayatollahs of diplomacy and they don't get very far. Diplomacy is always working, bringing one party to another, and reconciling conflicting interests. And that was what my duty, my remit in Georgia was exactly that. You remember the little war, 2008, the Russians invaded Georgia, kept stand 15 kilometers from the capital, Tbilisi, which they could have taken within 24 hours without any problem, but the signal was there, keep calm, shut down, and so on. But in the meantime, damage was being done for a certain part of Georgia country called Abkhazia. And then I had to make sure that the people over there, in which Georgian ethnic people lived, could still have a normal life. And I tell you, the little things I could negotiate there with one of the vice ministers of the minister of Lavrov, Karasin, Gregory Karasin was his name. We negotiated, we negotiated small things, but very important for the people. For instance, just an example, the Georgians living in Abkhazia, Abkhazia is a totally different language and so on, had always worked and studied in Georgian language, but now there was a line of control which they could not transgress. We managed to make sure that every day there would be a couple of buses doing touring Abkhazia, taking up the children, bringing them to schools in the Georgian side. And the same for instance, medical urgent things. There was no medical facilities in Abkhazia of quality. They could come to the hospital. And that is peace building, step by step. And then we went up the ladder and we could come to more substantive political agreements between the Georgian side and the Abkhaz side, the rebel side, so-called.
Now, I want to make sure that we get some chance to hear from the students that they can ask your questions. And I want to maybe just ask you one final question, which is, we've talked about geopolitics and we've talked about diplomacy. We talked about the skills that you bring and that can be useful for us as we build our careers. And you've talked about sort of the big geopolitical considerations. Of course, some of us are also affected by these big events in a very personal way and often a very painful way. What would be your message to people who are affected by what's happening in the world right now? How do you deal with that? How do you move on with your life while terrible things are happening that also affect you?
Well, first of all, I would say, again, have a sober judgment on what's happening. And when I say that, that is because there is so much dramatization, proliferation, radicalization going on around us. And that is something that you have to phase away out of your mind and bring back everything to its essence, to what is it really, including the press, with all respect that I have for the press. But the press, instead of attenuating issues, puts a little bit, petrol on the fire. And I think a diplomat and a responsible citizen, and particularly somebody and people like you, who in the future would like to work for a better and also more prosperous world, I think you have to make a judgment, a sober judgment about what is this really about and how can I contribute that, including through business. How can I contribute to that kind of less radicalized, less proliferated way that we now so much. There is radicalization around everywhere.
I want to open it up now to questions from the students. And I just want to make a reminder. So, Ambassador Verbeke is an expert on diplomatic skills, or at least has been recognized as such and has written books about that. And that's really something that we want to learn from. We want to learn from what can we take away in our own life, whether in business or in personal life, from certain diplomatic skills or from diplomacy. So I welcome any questions about that. And recognize, of course, that while you will never say no comment, that there are also things that you cannot solve for us today. And so we want to be mindful of that as well. So let's have a look. Are there some questions in the room? I see one there, and then we'll take them by two and we'll go to the next round. So can we have a microphone? Yeah, there was a gentleman over here and a gentleman over there. So you might want to just introduce yourself, what you're studying, where you're from perhaps, and then ask your question.
Hello, thank you for being here. We really had some insightful information. My name is Firas. I'm from Libya. I'm studying international relations. I wanted to ask about your United Nations career. What got you into it? What got you from, working for your country to the United Nations? And how influential do you think your job has been? And what gave you that power of being influential?
All right. Well, thank you for the question. Um, UN, I had part of my life in the UN, as a matter of fact, for 6 years, but then with two different hats. One was as a Belgian diplomat in the UN. We call that permanent representative. And I had the privilege of sitting in the Security Council. Council as a non-permanent member, of course. Belgium is not a permanent member. You know the five. I don't have to tell you who they are. We already mentioned them in the very beginning of our
Right, right.
All right.
I guess
So
we didn't mention the UK. I guess we didn't mention the UK.
we did, and France,
Right.
UK and France, but the three others we mentioned. Right. So you have the permanent and non-permanent, but and now I was the non-permanent member for Belgium. And now the interesting thing, and I go back to the distinction I made of power and authority. When you are in the Security Council, what counts is the soundness of your argument
Mm.
and not the largeness of your mouth, if I may say so. With that, I mean the kind of hard power. You may have 20 divisions, the other one, and you only two. Well, that doesn't really count in a negotiation setting, which is the Security Council. And that is why we had a very smooth interaction between non-permanent members and permanent members. I, for one, for instance, I had a fantastic working relationship with the Russian ambassador because he just was a productive guy, although we had very different views on certain conflicts, including the Georgia conflict that I just mentioned. So that was top. If you ever can sit in the Security Council, take it. But then the second hat I had was after I finished that job as a permanent representative of Belgium to the United Nations, then Ban Ki-moon at the time was the
Secretary General.
Secretary General, Consul General, I was going to say, Secretary General, and he asked whether I could go to Lebanon first, because it was a little bit earlier than the war, which I did. And there I had to deal basically from Lebanon, from Beirut. We were covering both Syria and Israel as far as politics is concerned. And those right ahead, there must be Lebanese people around here in the room. They know very well that one way or another, their life has always been predicated on what happened in Syria for a long time. Basically, politics in Beirut was dictated out of Damascus, and then, of course, also in Israel. But then I came to Gaza, to Georgia, and that I just explained what I did
Yeah.
there. So there were the kind of complementarity
The-
jobs, permanent representative, and then what we call special representative of the Secretary General.
And I'm going to say, we assume
SRSG.
that of course, because you played a very productive role in the UN as an ambassador from Belgium, that of course helped you
Well,
build into the UN system
one
as a
one
special.
thing brings the other because the focus when you are a member of Security Council, you are really the lights are on you, and it's not just the Secretary General who watches you. There are a lot of other people over there in New York, and somehow that helps you.
I mean, I think it's a lesson for all of us, isn't it? That when you don't always choose whether you get a seat at the table, but when you get at the seat at the table, you can define whether you put it to good use or not, and that can lead to good things both for your country or your
Yeah.
interest, and for yourself personally in terms of your career. I think that's a valuable lesson in its own right. I suppose the follow-up question, at least that I had about this UN topic, is of course we are now living in a situation where the UN is clearly declining in influence and even declining in its resources. We're seeing huge savings, huge
Yeah.
layoffs across the UN system. To what extent is there still a future for this type of organization in the world that we are going into today?
Well, the UN right now is in a bad position for the budgetary reasons that you mentioned, but particularly for the kind of geopolitical reason and a problem that we already discussed. That is that when you have rivalries between the permanent members of the Security Council, that is China, US, and Russia, because the French and the UK don't deserve their place anymore, if I may say that very prudently. If you look at the world at large, they should be replaced by others. But okay, there they are, and we never will change that. Those who sit there will continue to sit there. But no, there is a rivalry between those big ones, and they don't agree on anything, particularly not on anything that has to see with their power stretch, which basically means that the big things are not being resolved in the Security Council. The big things, therefore, as far as the UN is concerned, are not being resolved as such. And that is the paralysis in which the UN finds itself right now. So you have, on the one hand, lack of budget because the payments don't come in, and lack of workmanship because there is paralysis as far as the politics is concerned. What can we do? Just wait and see and hope that among those great powers, there will be a kind of, as I said, balanced formula, equilibrium that they will find, and then they can again sit in the Security Council and work together, and the UN can again take up its job.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective. The wait and see. Sort of sometimes it is actually worthwhile to wait and see.
Yeah.
In business, we don't like wait and see. We like to
Strategic patience.
we like to take strategic patience. We had another question over there as well, and then I'll get to a few more questions in the next round. I think it was right over here. If we can.
Hello, good morning. I'm Stefano, and I'm from El Salvador, and I'm also studying international relations. My question is, how do you believe that the rise of authoritarianism via misinformation or rhetoric or demagoguery has affected European diplomatic actions in the West or in the East?
Rise of authoritarianism in the world affected Europe. Yeah? All right. Well, the short answer is because until now we didn't wish to play the authoritarian card in the first place, whereas the others do play it. There are some pressures, as you know, within the European Union. There are some countries which have, to some extent, an authoritarian reflex. We think, for instance, about what's happening with Orban in Hungary, but some other countries as well, Slovakia and others, may be tempted to go the authoritarian formula. I don't think Europe will easily become as such an authoritarian for the simple reason that, and we have to live with that, Europe, although we so often speak about Europe as if it is an established entity, it is not. And again, that's a lesson in diplomacy. You have to accept that there are suboptimal formulas. The European Union is a fantastic thing. But given the fact that it is still a union of member states, you have to accept that hybrid character of what the European Union is has its strengths, the union side, but its weaknesses, it's a union of separate, sovereign, and independent countries. And that equilibrium again plays out and is one of the reasons why we should not too much expect from Europe. Our level of expectation very often has been too high in terms of the capacity for delivery by the European Union. We should take Europe for what it is. It is, I like to say, it is a unique historical political experiment in working together. And we've done a lot in terms of progress working together. There is no other place in this globe, on this planet, where the same formula have been tried. And I think we did well. The advantage of my formula, that you look at European Union as an experiment, experiments can succeed and can fail. And there are good days and there are bad days. And if you look at it in that way, then you don't have that kind of expectation gap that we often have now. Then you say, well, not bad where we stand. If you look where I started with a kind of just common market of potatoes, and then the coal and steel community. All this was very down to earth, and then we had the single market, not the common market, the single market, and from the single market we had the European Union with a CFSP, a common foreign security policy, and so on. So we are making progress, but we still are not the equivalent of a state, a sovereign state. And that is then finally the answer to your question. Why are we not authoritarian? But basically,
Yeah,
because we are not the state as such.
But I suppose another question related to this one is, if we are headed to a world of raw power and authoritarianism in the great powers, how can we even safeguard what we have in Europe, um, being as it is that we don't have hard power and that we don't have a strong government?
Yeah, but the answer there is that we are working on the hard power. As you see, the defense budgets at this time are rising indeed up to 5%.
And you do consider that to be an inevitability in the world that we're headed in?
I think we have to acquire a good doses of hard power, not because we want to fight the other, but because we want to be an equal partner in that kind of quadrilateral conversation. That is what we aim at as Europeans. We aim at a quadrilateral conversation where we are an equal partner with the US, with China, and with Russia. And that we can only do not by increasing further the soft power that we have. We have the most soft power of all of those, but by having the equivalent hard power raised up.
Yeah, okay, that's a clear answer. I guess we're gonna have a few more questions over here, over there. I think there's somebody there. Yep, and then a final one over there. And I think that's gonna be all we have time for. So we'll get the questions first, Ambassador Verbeke. The 3 questions. So one here, one there, and then over there as well. And perhaps you can stay on afterwards because I see now more and more questions are arising. So we'll get the questions first and then the answers.
Okay. Thank you for this opportunity to ask a question. I'm from Ukraine, having a degree.
You're from what country?
Ukraine. Yeah, I received a degree in politics and economics in Prague, and I have a question about diplomacy and UN in particular. So currently you mentioned the shift which is happening from the rule-based world order to power-based, let's say. And how do you use the role of the UN in this changing world? Because currently many would argue that it is losing its relevance and its position is changing. So how do you use future?
Well,
Thank you so much. Do you want to get the other questions still, or do you want
I can
Okay.
quickly answer.
Yep.
No, the UN has no significant role to play. Let's fear it. I don't want to embellish something which is not there in the first place. It's a fact of life right now that we live, as you said and repeated, we live in a world of brute power, one against another. And that gives us no space whatsoever to have institutions like the UN come in and play a significant role. They will play perhaps a role when we are in the reconstruction stage, reconstruction and rehabilitation, but not in solving the conflict as such. The Security Council, as I said, is in paralysis, and it's the only place where the beginning of an answer to your problem could be given. It will be given in capitals, and that is what we see. It's Kiev, it's Ankara, it's Brussels, and some others.
Thank you. I appreciate your candor, but I find it also disheartening. There was another question over there, and then a final question over there. Because I'll be honest with you, if it was my country, I would be depressed by that answer, even if it is true. Is there anything that we can take out? So if it's not the UN, is there anything else that we can see for what would be?
The question here was specifically UN. If the question would have been European Union, then the answer would be different. As you very well know, we have now linked our fate to that of Ukraine. That's the whole point. If I may just make one footnote with that remark, that is the fate of Europe being linked to Ukraine, that is clearly that link has been made by Europe not just for the sake of Ukraine, with all due respect, again, but because the Ukrainian problem is a problem of European security. And the real two parties which face each other eye to eye is Russia and Europe. Europe, including Ukraine. That's the mentally way of looking at it. It's Russia and Europe that are in conflict right now.
Yeah. Thank you. I find that very helpful. To your question.
Hi, I'm Mike. I'm from the United States. Earlier you mentioned, I guess a situation where a diplomat had to go to Beijing with 10 contracts that needed to be signed, and obviously to try to influence the human rights situation at hand. I guess my question, and more of just hoping you can elaborate, is like in that situation. I guess there's a moral gray area of what's more important: getting those 10 contracts signed or influencing the human rights situation at hand. And I guess I'm wondering how each of those play into each other. And obviously, in some cases, maybe getting those 10 contracts signed will lead to improving the human rights situation. So I guess my question is, what's more important, and in what order do you want to handle both those issues, and how, do they
Yeah.
come together to find success?
Well, excellent. Thank you.
Look, it's a question of balance. That's the whole point of what I try to explain. And that is core to diplomacy. That is why an answer of a diplomat will never satisfy all people sitting in the room. Let's say we have two conflicting parties, and I'm being called as a diplomat to mediate between the two. Of course, the compromise solution that will come out of our work will be not to the full satisfaction of party number one, not to the full satisfaction of party number two. That is exactly what I think will be a good compromise. A good compromise, as we say, is one that displeases both parties, but allows them to go on and to go their way. And the same in answer to your question, that's the same thing. You may not forget that in contrast to NGOs, for instance, all of them have their one they have what I call tunnel vision. You have an NGO working on human rights only, an NGO working on climate change only, another NGO business entity selling weapons only. All right. For them, from each of them perspectives, they just go up to the end. All this comes together in one single mind of a minister of foreign affairs, and he somehow has to bring those threats together. And then he sees that the armaments question is not really that compatible with my seeking peace among those parties. Hence, embargo on weapons export or something like that. So that is the problem, and that is why the politicians there is no school for political science. A politician must always bring those contradictory things together, and what comes out of it is, it doesn't smell very well. It's not very clean and neat, but that's politics, and that is why I also tell very often my friends, politics is muddling through. It's not the course in logic with premise and second premise, minor and major and conclusion. That's not the business of a diplomat or of a politician.
Excellent. And I have to laugh because, of course, there are schools of political science. In fact, you teach at some of them. But but I suppose you mean that the actual fact of having to do it, not something you can learn. You have to do it on the job. Final question, and then we will move to our second speaker.
Yes, hello, thank you. My name is Alejandro. I'm from Mexico. And my question is mostly related to how would you define the concept of power while reconciling it with another concept that I think is fascinating from Peter's new book on the four capitals of human
I
capital,
didn't get
social
that.
capital.
How would you define power?
But yeah, so I wrote a book recently on the new nature of business, talking about four capitals. That there's not only financial capital that matters, but also natural capital, human capital, and social capital. Go on, and maybe repeat the last part of your question.
Yeah, so how would you reconcile it with a concept like that and your definition of power, which is, like as you mentioned, the hard assets, and I guess now in terms of politics, conflict, or
Yeah, all right.
showing strength?
I mean, how do you combine the world we live in
Let's see.
terms of how power with
The social human,
Yeah.
and then well, I think there is a continuum there. There is a spectrum going from hard, tough, brute power to power of transactions and so on. And then we come in the softer side, that is the side of social interaction, and then the human. Ultimately, the ultimate value is we human beings, we all have human dignity to care for. And you may be the toughest businessman, being in the sector of weapons industry, why not? But at the end of the day, it's human dignity that you will be reckoned upon in your business. So what you do, and to answer now to your question, is again, you try to incorporate those different dimensions in one single equation, if I may say so. I don't know what your solution to bringing those four dimensions together, but in one way or another, the important point is that you mentioned also the human social dimension. You have to bring them somehow together, and that is the art of, I think, a great businessman. The big, as you see, I worked in London as well for some time, and at some stage, public authorities there, the foreign ministry, was organizing seminars in human rights for business people only, bankers and business people. And the whole point was, look, you business people, if you want to go ahead in your business, you'd better watch also the human dimension, the human rights dimension. And then you have the examples of IKEA and others who have, for instance, boycotted certain countries. Was it South Africa? With apartheid, South Africa with apartheid has been blocked by big multinationals for the sake of human rights. That's your model, I
No.
do.
Yeah, it's true. And it's funny you mentioned that because the former CEO of IKEA is now one of the main candidates to become the new UN High Commissioner for Refugees. So I suppose they really did mean it. They are doing that. With that, I think our time with you has come to an end. You see, I have a Swiss watch, Ambassador Verbeke, so I know exactly when the time has arrived. But we have been able to really get a panoramic view of your experience and your skills. It was a tremendous pleasure and an honor to be able to share this time with you. And so on behalf of everyone here in the room, I want to thank you. And of course, we hope we see you back here again, Johan Verbeke or Johan Verbeke. It's a great honor to have Johan here. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.